In the skies above Europe during World War II, German fighter pilots initially dismissed a new American fighter as nothing more than a flying milk jug. They called it Jug, a nickname that seemed to perfectly capture its bulky, ungainly appearance. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was massive, weighing nearly 8 tons fully loaded. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war. German aces, flying their sleek Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, laughed at this American giant. They believed their nimble fighters would dance circles around it. But their laughter died in their throats when they heard a sound that would haunt German pilots for the rest of the war: the devastating roar of 8 50 caliber machine guns, all firing simultaneously. This is the story of how the P-47 Thunderbolt went from being ridiculed to becoming one of the most feared and effective fighter aircraft of World War II. It's a tale of engineering brilliance, pilot courage, and raw firepower that changed the course of aerial warfare. The story of the P-47 begins not with a single moment of inspiration, but with hard lessons learned in blood across the skies of Europe. In 1940, the Battle of Britain raged, and American military observers watched with growing concern. The fighters they had thought were adequate were being outclassed by German designs. Alexander Kartveli, the brilliant Georgian-American engineer at Republic Aviation, understood that the future of fighter design was changing. He had already designed the P-43 Lancer, but intelligence reports from Europe made it clear that something far more powerful was needed. The United States Army Air Corps issued a requirement that seemed almost impossible. They wanted a fighter that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, fight at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and survive the brutal punishment of combat. Most challenging of all, it needed to be powered by the massive new Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower monster that was the most powerful radial engine in production. Kartveli faced a monumental challenge. The R2800 engine was enormous, and radial engines required complex cooling systems. To get the power to the propeller efficiently at high altitudes, he needed a turbocharger, a device that was still relatively new and untested in fighter aircraft. His solution was revolutionary and controversial. Instead of trying to minimize the size of the aircraft, Kartveli embraced it. He designed the P-47 around the massive engine and turbocharger system, creating a fighter that was larger and heavier than any single-engine fighter before it. The fuselage was deep and wide, necessary to house the intricate ducting that carried exhaust gases back to the turbocharger in the rear of the aircraft, then channeled the compressed air forward to the engine. This system allowed the P-47 to maintain its power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for air. The first XP-47B prototype took to the skies on May 6, 1941. Test pilot Lowry Brabham pushed the aircraft through its paces, and despite some early concerns, the results were impressive. The P-47 was fast, capable of speeds over 400 miles per hour. It could climb to 15,000 feet in just 5 minutes. And it was tough, built like a tank with armor plating protecting the pilot and critical systems. But there was skepticism everywhere. Pilots accustomed to lighter fighters looked at the P-47's bulk with suspicion. Some called it 7 tons of scrap iron. Others wondered if something so heavy could possibly maneuver in combat. The British, who had been promised some of the new fighters, took one look at it and decided to stick with their Spitfires. What these critics didn't yet understand was that Kartveli had created something unprecedented. The P-47 wasn't designed to dogfight like a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt. It was designed to be a high-altitude interceptor and escort fighter, using its speed, altitude performance, and devastating firepower to dominate the skies in a completely different way. If there was one feature that would define the P-47 Thunderbolt in combat, it was its armament. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. This wasn't just impressive on paper, it was absolutely devastating in practice. Each 50 caliber machine gun could fire between 700 and 800 rounds per minute. When all 8 guns fired together, the P-47 could pour out over 100 rounds every second. The combined weight of fire was approximately 60 pounds per second, meaning that in a 2-second burst, the Thunderbolt hurled 120 pounds of lead and steel at its target. The 50 caliber round itself was a masterpiece of destructive engineering. Weighing nearly 2 ounces, it could penetrate armor plating, tear through aircraft structures, and had enough range to be effective at distances where smaller caliber weapons were useless. The Americans loaded their ammunition belts with a mixture of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, creating a lethal cocktail that could destroy almost any target. The installation of these guns in the P-47 was carefully engineered. They were positioned far out in the wings, which meant they had a wide-spread pattern. This actually had advantages. A pilot didn't need to aim with perfect precision to hit a target. If you got a German fighter in your sights and pulled the trigger, the cone of fire from 8 guns was likely to strike home. Each gun was fed by ammunition boxes in the wings, giving the P-47 a total ammunition capacity of over 3,000 rounds. In practical terms, this meant about 30 seconds of sustained fire, or more realistically, 15 to 22-second bursts. This was enough ammunition for multiple engagements in a single mission. The sound of these 8 guns firing simultaneously became legendary. Pilots described it as thunder, hence the aircraft's name. German pilots who survived encounters with P-47s reported that the sound was unlike anything else in the air. It wasn't the rapid staccato of smaller caliber weapons, but a deeper, more ominous roar. The recoil from firing all 8 guns was substantial. The entire aircraft would shudder, and inexperienced pilots could be thrown off their aim. Veteran P-47 pilots learned to fire in short, controlled bursts, keeping the airplane steady and ensuring maximum accuracy. But the true genius of the P-47's armament wasn't just in its firepower, it was in its reliability. The Browning M2 was one of the most reliable machine guns ever designed. In the harsh conditions of high-altitude combat, with temperatures far below zero and extreme vibration, these guns continued to function when other weapons would have frozen or jammed. Ground crews could access and maintain the guns relatively easily. Each gun could be removed and replaced without removing the entire wing panel. This meant that battle-damaged aircraft could be quickly returned to service, and guns that showed signs of wear could be swapped out between missions. The psychological impact of this firepower cannot be overstated. German pilots quickly learned that getting caught in the firing arc of a P-47 was often fatal. The density of fire was so great that evasive maneuvers often just meant getting hit in a different part of your aircraft instead of avoiding the rounds entirely. The P-47 Thunderbolt arrived in England in late 1942, assigned to the 8th Air Force. The first units to receive them were the 56th, 78th, and 4th Fighter Groups. The pilots, many of whom had trained on lighter aircraft, approached their new mounts with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Captain Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, an experienced pilot who had flown Spitfires with the Royal Air Force, summed up the initial reaction. "It looks like a milk bottle with wings." The nickname, Jug, short for Juggernaut, stuck, though whether it was meant as a compliment or an insult was unclear at first. The early missions were frustrating. The P-47's range was limited to about 175 miles from base, which meant it could barely reach the German border before having to turn back. The Luftwaffe, aware of this limitation, simply stayed away from the coast and waited for the American bombers to penetrate deeper into German airspace, where the P-47s couldn't follow. The first combat mission was flown on March 10, 1943. It was a sweep over France, and the results were inconclusive. No enemy aircraft were encountered. The second mission, on April 8, saw the first aerial victories but also the first losses. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group, and he understood that his pilots needed to learn how to fight in the P-47. It wasn't a turning fighter like the Spitfire or the German Bf-109. Trying to dogfight at slow speeds was asking for trouble. Instead, Zemke drilled his pilots in the tactics that would make the P-47 deadly. Use your speed, Zemke instructed. Use your dive. Hit them hard and fast, then use your power to climb back up. Don't try to turn with them. This became the doctrine of P-47 operations, boom and zoom tactics. Dive down from altitude, make a single devastating pass with those 8 guns, then use the P-47's powerful engine to climb back to safety. The P-47's first major engagement came on April 17, 1943. A force of Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group encountered a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s over the Belgian coast. The German pilots, confident in their aircraft's superiority at medium altitudes, pressed their attack. What happened next shocked the Luftwaffe. The P-47s didn't try to turn fight. Instead, they dove through the German formation, guns blazing. The weight of fire from the American fighters was overwhelming. In seconds, 3 FW-190s were falling from the sky, trailing smoke and flames. The remaining German fighters broke off, clearly rattled by the ferocity of the attack. Captain Don Gentile scored the 4th Fighter Group's first kill in a P-47 that day. His combat report described how his 8 guns literally tore his target apart. I gave him a 2-second burst from about 200 yards. I saw strikes all over his fuselage and wings. Pieces started flying off, and then he just exploded. But the Germans were learning too. They realized that at altitudes below 15,000 feet, their fighters could outturn the heavy American fighter. German tactics evolved to try to drag P-47s down into turning fights at lower altitudes where the Thunderbolt's advantages disappeared. The Americans countered by maintaining altitude discipline. Fight commanders insisted that at least one flight in every group stay high, ready to dive down to help if their comrades got into trouble below. This mutual support system meant that German pilots who thought they had trapped a P-47 in a low-altitude turning fight suddenly found themselves being bounced by other Thunderbolts diving down from above. May 4, 1943, saw a major air battle over Belgium. The 56th Fighter Group, led by Zemke, encountered a large formation of Bf-109s escorting German bombers. In the swirling dogfight that followed, the P-47s claimed 8 victories for the loss of 3 of their own. But more importantly, the German bomber formation was broken up, and several bombers were shot down. The Luftwaffe was beginning to realize that the P-47 wasn't the easy target they had expected. Its rugged construction meant it could absorb incredible amounts of damage and keep flying. Pilots reported hitting P-47s repeatedly, seeing their rounds strike home, only to watch the American fighter keep flying. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group had an experience that became legendary. On June 26, 1943, his P-47 was jumped by FW-190s over France. In the attack that followed, his aircraft was hit by over 200 cannon and machine gun rounds. His canopy was shattered, his controls were damaged, and fuel was leaking from punctured tanks. But the P-47 kept flying, and Johnson managed to nurse it back across the English Channel to England, making an emergency landing at a coastal airfield. His survival was a testament to the P-47's incredible toughness. By the summer of 1943, it was clear that the P-47's limited range was its greatest weakness. American bomber losses were mounting as they penetrated deeper into Germany, beyond the range of fighter escort. Something had to be done. The solution came in the form of external drop tanks, disposable fuel tanks that could be attached under the wings or fuselage of the P-47. These weren't a new concept, but implementing them effectively on the Thunderbolt required extensive testing and engineering. The first drop tanks were 75-gallon paper tanks, built with laminated paper impregnated with plastic. They were cheap to produce and surprisingly effective. Later, pressed steel tanks of 108 gallons and eventually 150 gallons became available. With these external tanks, the P-47's combat radius increased dramatically from 175 miles to eventually over 400 miles. This extension of range transformed the air war over Europe. By late 1943, P-47s could escort bombers to targets deep in Germany. The Luftwaffe could no longer wait safely inland for the bombers to arrive unescorted. The American fighters were now everywhere. The introduction of water injection systems further enhanced the P-47's performance. By injecting a mixture of water and methanol into the engine, pilots could temporarily boost power output by several hundred horsepower. This emergency warp power could be used for short periods, usually 5 or 10 minutes, giving P-47 pilots a critical advantage when they needed it most. With water injection activated, a P-47 could reach speeds of over 440 miles per hour in level flight, and climb rates that astonished German pilots. Stories began to circulate of P-47s outrunning and outclimbing everything the Luftwaffe could throw at them. Lieutenant Francis Gabreski, who would become America's top-scoring P-47 ace in Europe, described the feeling of engaging water injection during combat. You'd push the throttle past the stop, and it was like someone lit a rocket under you. The airplane would just surge forward. It gave you incredible confidence knowing you had that extra power available. The tactical situation was now completely different from the early months of 1943. American fighter pilots could range far and wide, hunting for German fighters. The Luftwaffe was forced to adopt more defensive tactics, carefully choosing when and where to engage. Colonel Hubert Zemke's 56th Fighter Group became particularly adept at long-range escort missions. Zemke developed tactics that maximized the P-47's strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. His fighters would fly high, maintaining altitude advantage, scanning for German interceptors while staying close enough to the bomber stream to intervene if needed. When German fighters did appear, the P-47s would typically split into two elements. One element would maintain altitude, while the other dove to engage. The high element could then dive on any German fighters that tried to pursue the attacking P-47s. This layered defense proved extremely effective. By October 1943, the 56th Fighter Group had become the highest-scoring fighter group in the 8th Air Force. Their success wasn't just measured in kills, but in bombers protected and missions completed. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been faltering under heavy losses earlier in the year, was now sustainable. But this success came at a cost. P-47 pilots were flying longer missions, often lasting 4 or more hours. The stress of high-altitude flight in unpressurized cockpits, combined with the constant threat of combat, took its toll. Fatigue became a serious concern, and rotation policies had to be implemented to ensure pilots weren't pushed beyond their limits. The primary mission of the P-47 in Europe was bomber escort, and this role defined much of its combat history. Flying escort was grueling, demanding work that required discipline, patience, and split-second decision-making. A typical escort mission would begin before dawn. Pilots would be briefed on the bomber stream's route, altitude, and timing. The P-47s would take off and form up, then climb to altitude usually between 25 and 30,000 feet. At these heights, the temperature was 40 degrees below zero or colder, and the thin air made every breath a conscious effort despite oxygen masks. The fighters would rendezvous with the bombers at a predetermined point, often over the English coast. From there, it was a matter of maintaining position, scanning constantly for enemy aircraft, and managing fuel carefully to ensure enough remained for the flight home. German interceptors used a variety of tactics to try to break through the fighter screen. Sometimes they would attack head-on, hoping to disrupt bomber formations and create chaos. Other times they would lurk above, waiting for an opportunity to dive through the fighters and hit the bombers from above. P-47 pilots had to constantly balance two conflicting imperatives: stay with the bombers, or pursue German fighters. Chasing enemy aircraft might result in kills, but it also meant leaving gaps in the protective screen that other German fighters could exploit. The most disciplined fighter groups learned to resist the temptation to chase. They maintained their positions, only breaking off to engage when German fighters came within range of the bombers. This required tremendous self-control, especially when enemy fighters were visible nearby, seemingly presenting easy targets. Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described the psychological challenge. You'd see a German fighter, maybe off to the side, climbing for altitude. Every instinct told you to go after him, to get that kill. But you had to think about the big picture. If you left your position, you might be leaving a hole that 10 other German fighters could use to get at the bombers. It was frustrating, but it was the job. The presence of P-47s had a measurable impact on bomber losses. On missions with adequate fighter escort, bomber casualties dropped significantly compared to unescorted missions. The psychological effect on bomber crews was equally important. Knowing that fighters were overhead gave them confidence and improved morale. There were still dark days. October 14, 1943, became known as Black Thursday when a raid on Schweinfurt resulted in the loss of 60 B-17 bombers despite fighter escort for part of the mission. The fighters' range still wasn't enough to provide protection all the way to the target and back. But even on that terrible day, the P-47s that were present fought desperately to protect their charges, and several German fighters were shot down in the process. As 1943 turned to 1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang with its superior range began to take over much of the deep penetration escort work. But the P-47 remained vital to the air war, and its role was about to evolve in ways its designers never anticipated. While the P-47 had proven itself as a fighter and escort, it was in ground attack that it would truly become legendary. The same characteristics that some had criticized: its weight, its rugged construction, its massive engine made it ideal for the most dangerous mission in military aviation: close air support. The P-47 could carry an impressive bomb load. Up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, rockets, or a combination of both could be hung from underwing racks. This was more than many dedicated light bombers could carry. With this ordnance, and its 8 machine guns, a single P-47 could deliver devastating strikes against ground targets. But perhaps more importantly, the P-47 could survive the intense ground fire that destroyed so many other aircraft attempting ground attack. Its air-cooled radial engine could sustain significant damage and keep running. There were no vulnerable coolant systems to be punctured. The cockpit was protected by armor plating. The entire airplane was simply tough. The 9th Air Force, established to provide tactical air support for ground forces, began receiving P-47s in late 1943. These aircraft would operate at low altitude, often below 1,000 feet, attacking German positions, supply lines, and armored vehicles. The tactics developed for ground attack were very different from high-altitude bomber escort. P-47s would patrol assigned areas, working closely with ground controllers who would direct them to targets. Communication between air and ground became critical to success. When attacking, P-47 pilots would typically dive at their targets, releasing bombs or rockets, then pulling up and strafing with their machine guns. The 850 caliber guns were devastating against soft-skinned vehicles, locomotives, and troops in the open. Even against armored vehicles, concentrated fire could damage tracks, optics, and external equipment, potentially disabling the vehicle. The invasion of France in June 1944 saw P-47s playing a crucial role. In the weeks before D-Day, Thunderbolts ranged across France, destroying bridges, rail lines, and supply dumps. This interdiction campaign crippled German logistics and made it difficult for reinforcements to reach Normandy after the invasion began. On D-Day itself, P-47s flew continuous patrols over the invasion beaches. German aircraft that attempted to interfere with the landings were met with overwhelming force. Throughout the day, Thunderbolts also struck German positions inland, disrupting counterattacks before they could develop. As Allied forces pushed inland, P-47s became a constant presence over the battlefield. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of their engines. When Thunderbolts appeared overhead, everyone scrambled for cover. Veterans of the Normandy campaign spoke of the psychological impact of American air superiority, the constant pressure, the inability to move during daylight hours without being attacked. The Falaise Gap in August 1944 demonstrated the P-47's devastating effectiveness in ground attack. As German forces attempted to escape encirclement, P-47s descended on the retreating columns, turning the roads into killing zones. Hundreds of vehicles were destroyed, and the German 7th Army was effectively annihilated. One P-47 pilot described the scene. "It was like shooting fish in a barrel, but we never forgot these were enemy soldiers trying to kill our guys on the ground. We did our job and we did it well." The P-47's contribution to the ground war cannot be overstated. It provided the close air support that allowed Allied ground forces to advance with confidence, knowing they had powerful aviation assets available when needed. The P-47 Thunderbolt produced numerous aces pilots who achieved 5 or more aerial victories. These men became legends, their names synonymous with the aircraft they flew. Francis Gabreski ended the war as the top American ace in Europe flying P-47s, with 28 confirmed victories. His aggressive but calculated fighting style made him a role model for other pilots. Gabreski understood the P-47's capabilities intimately, and used them to maximum advantage. Robert Johnson finished the war with 27 victories, all in P-47s. His survival after being hit by over 200 rounds became one of the most famous stories of the air war, demonstrating the Thunderbolt's incredible durability. Hubert Zemke, though he scored fewer personal victories, was perhaps the most important P-47 leader. His development of tactics and his leadership of the 56th Fighter Group made that unit one of the most successful in the entire 8th Air Force. These aces weren't superhumans. They were ordinary men who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. They learned to master a complex machine, to make split-second decisions in three-dimensional combat, and to overcome fear in a realm where mistakes meant death. By the end of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt had compiled an impressive record. More than 15,000 were built, making it one of the most produced American fighters of the war. P-47s destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and thousands more on the ground. But statistics alone don't capture the P-47's true significance. This aircraft, initially mocked as too big and too heavy, proved that innovation sometimes means challenging conventional wisdom. Alexander Kartvel's design philosophy: build it strong, make it powerful, give it devastating firepower, created an aircraft that excelled in multiple roles. The German pilots who once laughed at the ungainly Jug learned a harsh lesson. In aerial combat, what matters isn't just maneuverability or speed in isolation. It's the combination of multiple characteristics: firepower, durability, performance at altitude, and pilot training that determines success. The P-47 Thunderbolt earned its place in history not through elegance or beauty, but through raw effectiveness. It protected bombers, destroyed enemy aircraft, devastated ground targets, and brought its pilots home. In the end, that's what mattered. The Thunderbolt didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to win. And that's exactly what it did.